He fell from a rooftop and woke because a stranger's hand closed over his wrist. She called it a trick, a sleight of hand at a corner market, but the object in her palm belonged to his past. He didn't know the girl who saved him was the daughter of a night he had forgotten, and nothing in his life would be the same. He came back to himself with the dizzying taste of metal and the sharp white of the sky taking too long to steady. People shouted down in the alley below, shoes clattering, a thin halo of sirens that sounded far away. He thought, for the briefest second, that it had been a mistake to climb that high, that the ledger of his mistakes had finally added up to something irreparable. Then fingers closed on his wrist and the world snapped to attention with a single, ordinary human pressure. The hand that held him was small and warm, calloused at the edges, the thumb low and steady like someone who had learned to control quick movements. She was crouched at the edge of the rooftop as if it were nothing at all. Dark jacket, hair loose and wind wild, eyes that did not blink when she looked at him. She smiled once like a performer who had landed a trick, and the smile was the kind that made people think they had seen a private joke they weren't invited to understand. He tasted the metallic tang of his own fear and asked before his head could think properly, "Who are you?" She answered with a flourish, showing him a coin that had been palmed and a scrap of folded cloth with a tiny dented locket stitched into it. It was ordinary, almost silly, the kind of thing street vendors sold by the fistful. Except he felt something in him tilt at the sight, a memory his life had misplaced tugging like a loose thread. She said her name was Lila, and that saving him wasn't heroic, just an available crowd part and a trick gone honest. She said she did sleight of hand for coins and smiles and sometimes for supper. When he laughed, it was a small, incredulous sound, the kind billionaires make when reality drops a pebble into the pond of their careful certainties. He did not feel flattered. He felt unnerved. He was used to being the one who watched from height, the one who paid people to be dramatic while he made decisions that pushed lives one way or another. To be the man who needed catching felt awkward and fragile. He tried to stand and realized the world still shifted oddly beneath him. She steadied him with her other hand and said, "Sit. You're pale." There were sirens then, close enough that the rooftop's edge thrummed with approaching authority, and she shucked one of her small, battered gloves, tucked the locket inside and winked at him like a conspirator who'd just rearranged fate. When people first saw the footage on phones the next day, it looked like a polished little story. Billionaire, minor accident, street performer saves the day. In the kind of world he lived in, such a story bent toward the convenient. Publicists drafted statements, aides said everything was under control, and investors called to ask whether the man would be fine for the meeting at 9. He sat through phones and questions with a guarded, practiced face. The accident folded into the pile of anomalies executives dealt with, but privately, in the quiet of his penthouse, he found the dented locket pressing against his ribs like a question. He had seen one like it once, decades earlier. It had been the sort of thing a man carried in a pocket he then emptied with a drink or a wrong choice. Memory in his world was slippery, polished by time and money, so he did what rich people do when something discomfits them. He hired discretion. DNA tests were the province of tabloids, but investigators could ask polite questions and do quiet searches. He instructed them to find the girl, not because he expected some melodramatic reveal, but because he wanted to know why a silly locket could make his chest tighten with the shame of a long-ago misstep. Lila kept doing what she had always done. She performed on street corners, let coins slip into her palm like small rain, and sold tricks for the price of a sandwich. She learned to disappear when the police wanted to make life hard, and learned which children laughed aloud and which adults felt sorry. She had learned to read crowds the way others read books. The locket in her pocket was heavier than it looked. It had been given to her as a child by a woman who told stories of short, bright nights and the quick, kind hands of a man who had left the next morning. The woman had called him a lover and a ghost, and Lila had grown into the stubborn person she became with a fierce hunger to see the world as a stage where the rules could be bent. She practiced tricks because it kept her hand steady, and because it taught people to look where she wanted them to look. That skill would come to matter in ways none of them anticipated. When the investigators asked questions at the alley where she performed, she ducked and smiled and performed a coin trick that left 3 men grinning, and one with an empty pocket. She did not want men with suits and soft voices asking about a mother who had learned to lie out of necessity. She wanted to be left to her small autonomy. The first time the Billionaire's team found her, it happened with the soft efficiency of people who could buy access. A driver, a polite woman with a discreet smile, handed her a card and asked if she'd consider a meeting about a charitable engagement. Lila laughed. She had the mechanic's distrust of men who offered everything without labor. But she was curious about the hand that had pulled him down. She had no plan to reveal the locket or to make any claim. She had not even considered the possibility he was anything other than a stranger who had helped. But curiosity is a patient thief. It steals bits of caution until you notice they are gone. She accepted a ride because sometimes rides meant warmth and because she liked to watch other people's houses as if they were sets, learning the small details of how different lives were furnished. She asked herself why a man with a suit would be on that rooftop at all. He asked himself why a girl performing tricks would be the one who saved him. Neither answer would come simply. At first they spoke in the neutral language of two people negotiating a brief interest. He wanted to be polite. She wanted anonymity. He offered money for a lunch she did not know if she should accept. She took the sandwich and the coin, and they ate awkwardly in a hotel restaurant where the other patrons pretended not to be listening. The billionaire saw in her hands the way a performer held objects: economy, a lightness that suggested control. She watched his watch, the small, cruel marker of authority that twinned with his name on lists and pillars. They traded stories in clipped sentences. Him, about the accident as a thing of paper to be smoothed, and her about acts and minor fame on the other side of the tram tracks. He did not ask, at least not directly, about her history. She did not volunteer it. But when he left, he pressed his palm to the dented locket in his jacket inexplicably, the motion small and private. He wondered if memory could be a thing he owned again, like a ledger entry he could check off. When he started to ask questions more pointedly, those around him bristled. The idea of a man's past leaking into his present was a matter of risk management. In his world, lineage mattered when it affected brand and shareholders. Board members worried about scandal, and his sister worried about the opening of old wounds. He had a life built on careful stories, philanthropic foundations, a second marriage in the papers years back that had ended quietly, a public face that smiled and met awards. The idea that a secret could rearrange that face made the people around him clamp down with advice. He listened briefly, and then he did the single thing money cannot do by itself. He read. He found receipts from an old hotel tucked away in a manila folder, the name of a woman he had once known in a night of joy and confusion. He found the address of the woman who had died when Lila was small, and a photograph of a locket that matched the one now dented in the girl's palm. The coincidence moved from possible to probable, and he felt the small beginning of responsibility unfurl in his chest, like a slow, reluctant flower. Lila's life shifted as well, but not like a public declaration. There was a private recalibration that happens when you suspect that a life's axis might have tilted because of someone else's past. She had been stubbornly independent because dependence felt like debt, and being a child of an absent man was an identity she had learned to carry without it asking for sympathy. If this man was connected to her the way the locket and the photograph suggested, it did not change her immediate needs. A place to practice tricks without being shooed away, food, a small safe place to sleep. But it changed her story in the way a single bright light reframes a stage. It could illuminate her or it could burn her. She feared both. She feared being used as a prop in a billionaire's attempt to rewrite history, and she feared being exposed as the thing her mother had once been forced to hide. She practiced tricks more often then, because tricks taught her how to hide things in plain sight, and because she could use the comfort of routine to keep her mind from racing. When DNA tests, polite and clinical, confirmed a biological link, the world tilted in the way financial markets do when a single rumor runs unchecked. The tabloids called it a fairy tale revelation, the morning shows drew it in with brighter music, and conspiracy forums read it as proof of a secret empire's soft underbelly. He wanted none of that, and yet he ordered statements to be prepared, truthfully minimalist. We are in the early stages of verifying a family matter and ask for privacy. He found to his surprise that privacy was a more expensive commodity than he had thought. People wrote op-eds about responsibility and about the strange cruelty of men who leave children uncounted. Strange strangers offered both condemnation and praise in equal measure. Lila read all of it with a peculiar detachment, as if the world were a spectator sport she understood better than most. She kept to the alley for a few days, performing to the street's small congregation, but the occasional laugh in the crowd was gone as phones buzzed and neighbors tried to catch a view of the girl who had been alleged to be an heir. The billionaire did not make a headline statement right away. He invited her to a private meeting instead, the sort of meeting that cost little and yet meant everything. He wanted to ask questions without cameras, to see if the woman in the locket had been who he thought she was, to confirm whether the past had a face he might plead to. They met in a private gallery where light fell in even sheets and where artwork made the air feel like a contest between money and meaning. He saw the locket in her hand then, and the small worn photo inside it. A younger woman with eyes like Lila's, hair tangled, laughing with just a moment of pain behind it. It was the face of a mistake. It was also the face of someone who had loved. He did not ask the obvious questions. Instead, he sat and listened as Lila told parts of a life that were sharp and concise. A childhood held together by small jobs, a mother who danced in and out of relationships, a history of being both seen and invisible. The billionaire felt awkward at times, like a man apologizing for a storm he had started without noticing. He found himself wanting to offer things that felt like atonement: money, help, a job. But he realized quickly that money looked like a bandage on a long ache. They stumbled into tenderness in strange ways. It began with small practicalities: a safer place for Lila to sleep for a few nights, a card left anonymously for a mechanic who could mend the trick she used, a quiet check for the mother's burial she had long postponed. He learned to do these things without fanfare because he feared that spectacle would turn repair into virtue signaling. Lila, for her part, accepted some of the practical help, but refused the limpness of a life bought for her. She wanted agency. She asked to be given a place to perform in a venue he could open to the public if she agreed, and he agreed on a condition that felt like mutual dignity. She would be allowed to teach children from disadvantaged neighborhoods tricks and theater, and he would fund the center without public announcement. It was a small thing, a workshop, a stage in a converted warehouse, but it changed more than either of them saw at first. The workshop became a place where other people like Lila found a table and a place to practice, where children were taught that skill and patience could be craft and not just survival. Conflict, of course, arrived. The billionaire's board felt exposed by his apparent softening. Rivals smelled weakness and wondered how quickly they could leverage a scandal into takeover. The press, which loved a tidy narrative, kept pushing the simplest story: the accidental father. Friends in his orbit wanted him to cut ties, to protect his brand, to treat this as a private matter quickly closed. Lila's community worried that she would be swallowed by the world she had always watched from the outside. Some of her old friends whispered that she would lose herself if she let the billionaire's life in. Others simply wanted a share of the sudden kindness that seemed to spill. Through it all, the two of them had to negotiate more than money. They had to navigate the grotesque ways the world commodified stories of redemption. There were moments of real fear where Lila would disappear for a day or two, performing in a different part of the city where the phones did not catch her, testing whether she was being used as a prop to humanize a rich man who needed it. There were also quieter, sweeter moments when they surprised themselves. They learned to talk without publicists listening in. They took walks where he learned to downshift from a life that ran on agendas to a life that could observe. She taught him the smallest of her tricks: a card that would always reappear where she wanted it to, a rope that tied into a knot with a flourish. He taught her to read contracts and to hire people who could protect her work. They argued about things that seemed trivial but were not: whether she should accept a staged interview, whether the workshop should wear a brand on its apron, whether his name should be on the plaque. Those arguments were the work of two people forming a relationship in the middle of a mess, not the neat arcs scriptwriters like. In private, away from the cameras and the op-eds, they found an ease that surprised both, like a late guest who found the front door open and stayed. The mother, who had once been a flicker in a photograph, became a fuller story with each document they found in the old manila folders. She had been young, full of laughter that turned brittle in small ways, and she had loved both recklessly and badly. The billionaire read letters she had written to a name he recognized and letters he had never seen because he had thrown them away in a fit of youthful bravado. The letters made him feel like a man at the edge of an apology he did not deserve and yet needed to give. He arranged a small private memorial for her with people who had known her briefly, and Lila attended with a calm that did not mean grief had left her, but that she had learned to carry grief in a particular hand. The flashy press tried to get a picture of them at the cemetery gate. He found a way to keep it still, to make the moment private, because some things did not belong to a public. As weeks became months, the city watched the unlikely father and the magician who had saved him, and the story shifted from scandal to possibility for many. The workshop became a hub for kids whose parents worked late and whose schools were stretched thin. Children learned balance and counting and how to hold an audience's eye. A shy boy found that speaking in front of 10 people was less like falling and more like learning to stand on a small ledge. A girl who had been told she was too loud learned to channel that voice into a performance that made people lean forward with wonder. For Lila, this work was not redemption or PR. It was a use of hands and heart that felt true. For him, watching the children learn felt like watching a ledger correct itself in ways that money never could. He realized that the small, ordinary acts of creating a place where people could practice dignity mattered more than any headline. There were, inevitably, choices that required courage. Board members pushed for a quick public reveal followed by a controlled PR strategy. Rivals tried to buy influence over the workshop's name and direction. Lila faced an offer to tour, to be paid handsomely and whisked away into a life that would be less lonely and far more public. She weighed these things and said no to the tour because she was wary of being made into a spectacle again. She wanted to control her narrative, not be told one. He watched her refuse a path that would have been simple, profitable, and prestigious, and felt his admiration deepen. He began to understand what it meant to be a father not by commanding but by listening. He learned that offers could be helpful or poisonous depending on how they were made and whether they respected the person they purported to help. When a scandal finally hit, a rival leaked a private email that suggested the billionaire had used the workshop as a tax shield. They had to navigate the worst instincts of the public. The headlines wanted gore, the rich man who gave back to hide his crimes. The reality was prosaic: accounting oversights, sloppy paperwork, a manager who had misfiled receipts. They handled it with blunt honesty. The billionaire opened the books, appointed new governance for the workshop, and let auditors comb through the finances. The gesture was costly in reputation and money, but it was honest. Lila watched, proud, as he chose transparency over spin. It did not end the criticism. Some people loved scandal more than charity, but it shifted the argument. People could now debate the merit of the work rather than the motive, and that was a better fight. Over time, the relationship between them changed from something tentative into something steady. It was not a fairy tale of quick repentance and instant happy endings. There were still nights when the billionaire woke thinking of the ledger of his life, and nights when Lila wondered whether she had given away her autonomy for the comfort of a warm bed. But those nights were less common, because they had learned to speak honestly about the costs. They discovered small soft mercies, a shared joke about a trick gone wrong, a dinner where they cooked together and burned the rice and laughed like children, a private concert where the billionaire listened to Lila teach a room full of teenagers the beauty of misdirection and the discipline of craft. The city watched them with interest, less with hunger. The headlines turned to other things because life does, in the end, continue. A moment that both of them remembered came not in public triumph, but as a small domestic scene. They were in the workshop, late, fixing a broken stage light when a boy wandered in who had once been too shy to sing in class. He stood in front of a mirror with a single bulb over his head and gave a small, shaky performance. The boy was not polished. His voice cracked, his hands shook. But when he finished, Lila clapped first and the billionaire followed. The applause felt like a public triumph, though it was not meant to be. The boy beamed as if he had won a medal, and both adults felt something warm and sturdy in their chests. That night they walked home in silence that felt comfortable, like two people finishing a long day's honest work. Years later, when the memoirs were occasionally mentioned in passing in polite social circles and Lila's name no longer made every morning's front page, people remembered the story not for its scandal, but for its odd tenderness. They remembered how a small coin trick had once changed the course of a life, and how a private locket had been a hinge between a past that could be ignored and a present that had to be faced. The billionaire had learned to be small and large in equal measure, small in his daily attentions, large in his willingness to use power to make public goods rather than private spectacles. Lila had learned to trust in structures she had once avoided, and to build a life where she could teach others how to steal the audience's gaze without losing themselves in it. They became less a cautionary tale and more a study in how people can be coaxed toward better versions of themselves when given room and not scripts. In quiet moments, they would sometimes return to the rooftop where the accident had happened, not out of sentiment, but because the place had become, for both of them, a marker of a day that altered everything. They would look out at the city that had been both indifferent and fascinated, the bright net of light shimmering like a city of tiny coins. They remembered how small the hand that saved him had seemed and how large the consequences became. They thought of the mother whose photograph Lila still kept in the locket, and they honored her with a plaque at the workshop and with a scholarship in her name for young women who needed the first kind of break she had never received. Life moved on in ways that were ordinary and stubborn. Contract negotiations, school plays, the occasional public appearance, and the ongoing work of running a space that existed to teach craft rather than to make headlines. They argued less about image and more about how to make the workshop sustainable, about the ethics of donations, and about how to keep young people safe in a city that could be both beautiful and crude. They had setbacks, a funder who backed out, a fire alarm that forced the workshop to close for a week. But they had learned to meet problems the way Lila taught a trick, with patience, repetition, and a readiness to fail until it worked. The child who had once been shy gave a speech at graduation and made the billionaire cry in a way he never admitted publicly. Lila felt proud in a way that had nothing to do with news cycles and everything to do with the small, persistent work of teaching. This is not a tidy end with every thread tied into a neat bow. There are always more missteps to be owned, more strained board meetings to survive, more nights where the city reminds you of what you were before you became otherwise. But the story of the man who fell and the girl who saved him stopped being a one-off headline and became, for many, a quiet model of accountability and possibility. It was not simply about blood relations or the shock of reunion. It was about two humans who chose, awkwardly and imperfectly, to repair something that had been broken. It was about a choice to make good on a past by building a better present, a choice that required humility, time, and the courage to be seen without the shields of easy excuses.